Hey everybody, welcome to Monday. Okay, so I'm going to tackle a complicated subject and I'm going to use game design terms. I'm going to use gamer terms to try to explain it. I'm going to use the common language of gamers. We're all the same that way to try to explain something that confuses the hell out of a lot of people. If you like this sort of content, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK. If every person who watches one of my videos, the equivalent of once a week, gave $1 to my patron, my bills would be paid. I could have to take on a lot less. I could look less harried. My hair could actually be dry in videos. Just saying. I know a lot of people can't because of COVID. But if you can because of COVID, become a patron for the people who can't. I'm just trying to be more rawr on my Patreon because I've been told I need to work on that. So, the video today. We've been talking a lot about gender identity. Not gender identity. And what's the difference there? Gender can be described as something you are, but also something you do. There's a lot of different theories of gender over the years, as well as the theories of biological sex over the years. And none of them quite do what they need to because they didn't contain this idea of gender identity. And it's like, what's the difference? Basically, think of it as gender is the way the world sees you. You look at me, you see a woman. And I do certain things to make it easier for people to make that association, like wearing makeup and having a cutesy poo hairstyle. Now, if you took that away and looked at my background, like if you took me out of it and looked at my background, a lot of people would assume that's a guy, right? Doesn't look like a quote unquote woman's background. That's how gender works, which is kind of bullshit, right? Just saying, kind of bullshit. But like this is one gender performance, makeup and soft hair. Behind me is a totally different gender performance. That's how gender works. That's how the performative theory of gender works, which is different from gender being a social construct, which we now know is wrong. Gender identity is inherent in the brain. It isn't all socially constructed. We recognize that there are differences between massive subcategory of men and massive subcategory of women, right? Now, what those differences are determined by society. Is it just a question of anatomy, or is it social role? Like indigenous myths say when a person is created, their soul is asked to choose between the bow and the basket. The bow being masculine, the basket being feminine. And a lot of people would be, wait a minute, why can't the woman be the bow? Well, this is the indigenous creation myth. The idea is that sometimes the creator goes, bow, basket, pick. And as the soul is reaching for their choice, the creator switches hands. So someone might have reached for the bow and got the basket. This is how some indigenous myths explain what they call two-spirit. Do not use the term unless you're an indigenous person, because the term two-spirit is a catch-all term for different indigenous peoples. They all have their own, but it is a renaming of the colonial term bardache, which is apparently a French slur for a male prostitute. I didn't know that's where bardache came from, but it was a replacement term because the French colonists in Canada put a slur on the fact that indigenous people recognized non-binary, non-cisgender gender identities. So it's men who feel like women, women who feel like men who feel like men, women who feel like women, and then split right down the middle. Nobody can choose. And the idea is that it was an inclusive system. instead of an exclusive system. Anglo-European social systems going back to, we have a lot of fundamentals from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, which were very big on kicking people out if they didn't comply. It was a conquest mentality. The term ostracism comes from the tendency for Athenian democracy to boot out undesirables, right? Drink hemlock or GTFO, right? Socrates' problem. And Socrates, there's an example of Socrates' identity as an Athenian made him choose the hemlock instead of leaving, which most people go, that's insane. That's how identity works. That's how a strong group identity works, right? That's what happens with gender identity. And a lot of people, I've used this explanation before, and people are like, I still don't get it. Fair enough. I figured out a way to explain it. Imagine gender identity is you in a video game, The Player. Imagine gender roles are a user interface, a control schematic that allows you to play the game called life. Okay? Certain control schematics, standard shooter. Okay, well, there's the Halo schematic, right? Where primary attack, gun, secondary attack, grenade. But then there's the Call of Duty schematic, which is primary attack, grenade. One schematic feels intuitive to base Call of Duty players. The other schematic feels intuitive to Halo players. Gears of War players who use essentially the same idea. Playing the other schematic, playing the other game, feels weird. It feels unintuitive. It's harder. You're not as good at it. So what usually happens in modern games is you're given the opportunity to change your control schematic, right? You can go to classic controls or modern or whatever the fucking name they slap on it. It's the ability to change your controls. That's how the interface between gender identity and socialized gender works. Creating additional recognized genders are basically creating new standardized user interfaces, control sets that work better for more people. So instead of having just the standard Halo and Call of Duty, we're like, well, there are other games that do things slightly different. The Assassin's Creed control scheme, right? Like, imagine the control schematic to your favorite game franchise. Just feels good to you. The way Ghost of Tsushima feels good to me, right? That's your gender identity. That's your gamer user interface identity. That is the way you can interface with in-game worlds with the least amount of friction. Now, what would you prefer to play? A game that allows you to set those controls so that you can engage in the game with the least amount of friction, the least amount of consciousness of something being a barrier between you and the experience you want to have in achieving success and proficiency at that experience, or something that, either you're very aware of this interface or you're not. You'd prefer the game that allows you to give you the least amount of friction through the user interface, right? That's the way gender identity works. And right now, we only have two. And right now, there's a lot of people who are feeling a lot of friction. They're very aware of the controls, trying to navigate life. That's because 25% of the population is not gender typical. So you've got 25% stuck between, you got Halo controls, you got Call of Duty controls, and you prefer Assassin's Creed controls or Tsushima controls. I love those controls. Now, somebody would say, big deal, adapt. Well, that's great. Those are probably people who are used to the Halo controls or the Call of Duty controls, right? I learned on those Halo gear shooters when I have to go to Call of Duty, I'm terrible. for far too long and never quite adapt. And then I go back to play Gears 2 and I'm like, better, right? Part of it is that's what I learned. Could I adapt? Sure. But then when I go back to playing the games, I learned on, then I gotta, why can't I just set the buttons to do what I want the buttons to do in the way I want to do them, right? This is something gamers expect. And yet we don't give people who have a lot of friction with the user interfaces of our cultures the same freedom. And that's why I think gamers are in a unique ability to get this, right? And you're like, yeah, but we don't have buttons to press in life, but we do, right? We do. Okay? You have to go, you have to go to the bathroom. I was at the drive-in over the weekend. We saw Tenet. We're not going into theaters because, no, the COVID. So a drive-in seemed like a good alternative. You go to use the bathroom. What's the first thing most people look for? Male or female, right? Most people immediately go, well, that's the bathroom that makes sense to me. I'm going to go there. That's the socially acceptable choice, right? Because it's a courtesy, it's a comfort to other people. In some U.S. states, you get arrested for going into the wrong bathroom. That's weird, because what if the other one's broken? We don't do that the same way in Canada. People might freak out, but we don't have the solution to everything is call the cops in Canada. But, in a lot of places, I remember we were shopping at a Victoria's Secret down in California, and up here in our lingerie stores, there's men there. It's not strange there's a chair, and men, the husbands or boyfriends, because up in Canada, we're quite utilitarian with this stuff. It's like, well, we know who's really getting the enjoyment out of this stuff, so let's make sure he likes it. And a lot of times you want a male opinion too. But sometimes it's just they're the ones you go shopping with, so they need to put. So we're down, and I don't know if it was the Beverly Center, and we did the thing that is normal up in Canada, and a very huffy Victoria's Secret employee kicked my husband out. She says, you can't be back here. And she said, everybody knows this. No, we're from Canada. We don't know this, right? The same thing happens if somebody doesn't look female enough, right? It's less so with male, because we don't feel the need to keep men behind cloisters for their own protection, right? Like, there isn't this constant fear of you're going to get raped everywhere, which is a problem we have to address in society. It's ridiculous the number of decisions women make so you don't get raped. It's just wrong, and we have to wonder what's wrong with our culture that this is ingrained. But that's what I mean about the user interface. People might be chuckling about this, but even between the US and Canada, it's that different. I think because in Canada, we don't have the same amount of reported crime. So it doesn't go through our heads that a common area in a change room would be, because we have a lot of single stall change rooms, and it's just, it's single stall, so you don't have to be separated. It's men and women use the same main mirror, but the stalls are individual. Nobody's seeing nothing, right? It's very different. That's what I mean about a user interface with life. When you get a government issued ID, if a person is living as a man and their government ID says female, what's the point of having those identifiable characteristics on government ID? So that a law enforcement official can make sure that's you, right? If people are not, if people are transgender, they need to be able to change their user interface so they can have a relatively frictionless play experience in life. That's the whole point. And so for the question, why Why is adding more genders and referring to the original gender binary of male and female so very different than the binary, even though we're invoking it? In order to understand that, you have to see past the placeholder languages. Like I said, don't think about it as male and female. Think about it as Halo controls, Call of Duty controls, right? Once you remove that, you see how offering Halo controls, Call of Duty controls, Assassin's Creed controls, Ghost of Tsushima controls. Well, you see the utility in that. You see the purpose. You see the point, right? Different people have different play styles. It emphasizes different features, everything like that, and it just feels more intuitive to play. We get stumped, and we understand that more options to a point is better. Too many options, it's a little confusing, though some games allow straight up remapping. You can just reassign a button, and that makes complete sense, and people are like, why wouldn't I use that? Why wouldn't I push the button that makes sense to me instead of, instead of constantly hitting a button because I think I should be hitting X and I'm hitting square, or square is the right answer, but I think it should be X, so on and so forth. We understand that intuitively when it comes to video game controls. The minute we throw gender into it, we have no point of reference beyond the binary. So our terminologies to get away from the binary invoke the binary so that people know what the fuck we're talking about. And that's when we get into the issue of terminology, that I can see the confusion of, somebody who doesn't understand this stuff going, well, why are we trying to get away from the binary if the terms we're saying to get away from the binary invoke the binary? I get the understanding. I get the confusion. And that's the problem with the non-binary other category that indigenous populations solve better. And they've attempted to create this term NB to get away from this syntax problem. Which the problem is NB is just the letter N, the letter B, which is non-binary. It's still invoking it. The problem is the gender binary has been this thing for so many thousands of years in, European society that people don't even like the term cisgender. Any change to it is just, people just react to the change because they're reacting to a change, right? Which sucks, but it's the reality. We're going to get stuck with these terms, but stop thinking about it that way. Think of it as genders 1 through 5. Now, how do we define those genders 1 through 5? Well, cisgender, transgender, male, female, split right down the middle. Don't get distracted by the term non-binary. It's option A, option B, option C. Yes, the option B is a midpoint between option A and option C, but it still is identifiable enough that it's its own set of characteristics. And that's the problem with this idea of non-binary being, well, you're not male, you're not female, what are you? In indigenous cultures, there's a term for it. In Christian enforced, European extraction cultures, we don't have a word. And for abstract thinkers like me, you don't need a word. You make up your own word. You're like, okay, well, that's the Assassin's Creed control scheme versus the Halo and the Call of Duty control scheme. If you're not an abstract thinker right there, you can't make that leap. And I understand why it's confusing. But I think that because you guys are gamers, you'll get it this way. The whole idea of creating a few more recognized gender options are basically just creating a greater set of options of control schematics that are very quick. You just blip blip. It's a few pushes of a button or a few tweaks of a stick, and you're there. Halo, Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, Tsushima. Right? I'm trying to think of a third one, but I'm sure there's a shooter configuration I'm not thinking of. But shooter and or open world configuration. Spider-Man, for instance. There's our 5. You can pretty much play every single game on the planet with one of those 5, right? They all do slightly different things. They all emphasize slightly different things. In some you have to run and jump, and some you don't. In some it's more focused on the gunplay. Others it's more manipulation and grappling and all that stuff. Gender works the same way. Certain control schematics reduce the friction in certain social roles, certain things you have to do within the game world we call life. It works exactly the same way. We don't get confused when we refer to it as Halo, Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, Tsushima, Spider-Man controls, right? All of a sudden people freak out when we start with, instead of Halo and Call of Duty like I did, with male and female. All of a sudden people become essentialists. And, well, there's innate qualities to womanhood. Yeah, there's innate qualities to Halo. There's certain things that make something a Halo game. You make a Halo game. Third person, that's not a Halo game anymore, I claim. It's in the same universe, but it's an offshoot. It's not the core Halo experience, right? Yeah, then you're in Assassin's Creed, you're in Gears of War, right? Third person Halo is Gears of War. It's a different thing. You see what I mean? So this idea that there are only 2 broad categories of human experience and something like that, and we can't, we can't get our brains around the idea that the only difference basically between, nuance aside, in how it plays, the only big difference between Halo and Gears of War is first person versus third person. Yes, the roadie run and all that, but you know what I mean. But we freak out over transgender and cisgender and claiming that transgender is not a real thing. We're getting boggled by terminology. And that's when people, again, get boggled by allegedly scientific terminology, but it's not really. It's a pseudo-religious approach to science, in treating science like it's immutable as opposed to the best we know now, right? And the fact is that being a cisgendered woman, you get very comfortable with your body doing weird things. I understand older men have a similar experience with it, but I mean, cramps and this and that, like anybody who says there isn't something to a body with ovaries, it is. It's a unique, it's a specific experience. This is why a cisgender female identity is important, but that doesn't mean that a transgender female identity isn't, Halo and Gears of War are both shooters, but, they're different. And Assassin's Creed and Ghost of Tsushima are still open world games, but there are differences between them. Some people would say not that many differences, but that's what some people say about the difference between transgender men and cisgender men, right? You see how well it works? And then I was looking for sort of a, besides the big 2 open world control schematics, or if you want to go Assassin's Creed Far Cry, right? Because that's third person versus first person. It's a more apt comparison, and put Tsushima as that, like, catch-all. Or something like Fallout, where you can switch in between, right? You can play first person, you can play third person. There you go. When we use gaming terminologies, everybody goes, well, yeah, we need words to describe things that are similar, but different. The same way we came up with the term Metroidvania to describe a specific type of gameplay, or roguelike to describe a specific type of gameplay. People who aren't gamers are like, roguelike, what does that mean? You play as a thief? No, you have to explain, right? We know what it means. Non-gamers don't. It's in-group terminology. But gender identities work the same way. The truth is that the way medicine is going is everybody will get an individualized medical profile based on their DNA. You know, there are different medical experiences within, say, the feminine or within, the masculine. The tragic loss of Chadwick Boseman, feels a lot like, losing Total Biscuit a few years ago, that we think dudes in their 30s and 40s should not die of colon cancer. There are clearly certain genetic predispositions to that stuff, because plenty of guys can completely abuse their bodies and not die young of colon cancer, right? Same with breast cancer. Some women have that breast cancer precursor gene, putting them at a much higher risk for breast cancer than other women. That's a much better indicator of that health risk than whether you're female. Same thing with men. Like, certain more specific genetic markers are a much better indication of medical risk than your anatomy. And so treating this idea that doctors need to know what's there. I mean, yes, if somebody has gender confirmation surgery and someone's doing abdominal surgery, yes, it's very important a doctor knows that. Hence the need for a dignified, normalized transgender identity. All the more reason we need that designation that's not stigmatized, so people don't have to hide it. So if you're unconscious and go to the hospital, a doctor doesn't kill you trying to save your life. Real simple. We recognize that until we're at that point, people need to be able to keep that part of themselves discreet. And, if we had fully digitized medical records, this stuff would not be a problem. Oh, this is this person? All right. I mean, if you come in as a John Doe, problem, but you know what I mean? There's no system that's going to solve every problem. And that's when we get into that, non-binary or sort of other category. And we understand this as gamers. There's some people that they want to be able to customize their control experience. They always want to remap just something, just because they can. That's them. We understand that, and so we have an option for them. The vast majority of people do not use it, but it's there. Same with people who identify as non-binary gender. It's a very small portion of the population, but it doesn't take that much to accommodate. Now, if they wanted a completely different controller design, no. And that's where the reasonable accommodation comes in, right? Most people recognize that she, he, they, them, that covers everybody in some way. A whole bunch of different pronouns. Not so much. The people that can't claim there are 23 discrete genders, I don't think that's functional, because choice paralysis with somebody kicks in after 4 to 6 options, the average person. We're in the reality that we're going to have to settle on somewhere between 4 to 6 genders, just because of the way that human minds work that we know thus far. But we also have to open it up to the fact that gender identity is in the brain. It's a real thing. It's identified. It's not just a social construct. The same way everybody needs some sort of controller, whether it's a PlayStation controller, an Xbox controller, a VR headset, a Kinect, whatever. You need some sort of interface to play the game. Everybody needs a user interface to interact with the world. That's what things like gender and race and that kind of thing do. Unfortunately, we live in a world where systems throughout time created disadvantages based on certain control schematics. We have to fix that by making more things that run on certain control schematics, certain user interfaces, but also recognizing that is there a moral judgment? Is there a right or wrong between Gears of War, Halo, Call of Duty, Far Cry, Assassin's Creed? No, they're just different. They serve different purposes in different scenarios. That's why they exist. There's utility somewhere. We have to start looking at gender like the same thing. So hopefully that sort of makes more sense. That gives it in terms you understand. I'm very curious about how people are going to react to this video. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Like I said, this was just trying to help people understand, not the final word. Thanks for watching.